the world. I think certainly Poland has borne the brunt of the refugee crisis to the extent that no other nation has. And so, on behalf of Ukrainians, I am profoundly grateful for everything that the Poles are doing. So, I will talk about hope in wartime, and I will start that with the fact that my life has been completely turned upside down since February 24th, since the very beginning of the war. A friend in London alerted me to the fact that the war has started with this simple statement: it is happening. I immediately called my brother in Lithuania and told him that our parents, who were at the time moved to the south of Kiev, where my brother had a log cabin, needed to be evacuated immediately. 200 phone calls later, we were able to convince them the day after the bombings that they indeed needed evacuation. So this is on day 2 of the war. This is my parents' faces are in a red rectangle, and then surrounding them are also some relatives and friends, and also a reliable friend who would be evacuating them from the south, from a little village south of Ukraine. So this particular Mitsubishi has certainly seen its fair share of troubles, as you can see. In about 100 miles that they covered, Mitsubishi has actually succeeded in having 2 flat tires. I don't know how that's possible, but exhibit number 1 is one of the tires that went wrong. This very, very long chain of cars, this never-ending chain of cars, just gives you a sense how arduous the journey was. And so the journey that would typically take from Kyiv to Kaunas, Lithuania, that would typically take an hour and a half by a low-cost plane, took 6 days and 7 countries in this situation. And so this is my parents who have traveled through Western Ukraine, and as they were traveling through the areas that were seemingly all right, in fact, there was shelling of the cities, and at least on 3 occasions they had to hide in the bomb shelters. And so this is my parents in the center, my brother to the left at the front, picking them up in Romania. So unlike so many others, unlike hundreds of thousands of others, indeed there was a situation where there was a backlog of about 80 hours in those first days of the war, and so they made the decision that they would be passing through the border with Moldova and then subsequently with Romania. And I have to say that, again, they were profoundly grateful to the volunteers in Romania who provided them with some warm food and also with this little cottage in the hills of the Romanian countryside, where the closest Airbnb is 200 miles away. How do I know it? Well, because, of course, I was trying to rent the Airbnb in question. And so this is day 5 of the war, and then 2 days after, they reached the safety of Lithuania. And my parents are presently all right. And so is my 98-year-old great aunt. Yes, this is not, I haven't misspoken, she indeed is 98. And she has joined them because we were able to evacuate her several days afterwards. We also, if you will, started specializing in evacuation because we discovered that essentially my brother had a friend or a colleague willing to help in just about every major city of Ukraine. So I think I've more or less answered the question for you. Why is it that we've created Rebuild Ukraine? It was that impulse principally to help what is presently really a bottomless human need. I will then specifically talk about the way in which Rebuild Ukraine is helping refugees, focusing on one story, and then we'll also dwell on the question of what could be done locally. So the humanitarian challenges presently in Ukraine are massive. You've all heard the stories of the South Ukrainian city of Mariupol, where a maternity ward and then subsequently a drama theater was bombed. And so the bombing of this many apartment buildings and other areas was principally civilian infrastructure, create, of course, enormous challenges. They create, and those challenges involve damage to infrastructure, and then that in itself entail food, water, heating, and then medicine shortages. And we specifically, the Rebuild Ukraine is specifically focusing on food shortages and then medicine shortages, and I will elaborate in a moment. The second important element that we are focusing on, because we have the capacity to help people inside Ukraine, we're also presently focusing on civilian defense volunteers. Some of you might know them also as terrestrial defense units. There are presently 300,000 volunteers like that, and these are people like you and me. These are engineers, businessmen, workers, teachers, unemployed, you name it, who have now joined resistance, who have essentially now joined a guerrilla fight. I have a philosopher friend who is exactly my age, teaches subjects that are very similar to mine. He is now a sniper and has actually now had 2 missions that were quite successful, thanks be to God. But that's the daily reality that people presently go through. And the kinds of choices that they're presently making are truly existential. They are choices between life and death. So because there are 300,000 volunteers, the Ukrainian government simply does not have the capacity to equip them. When I say equip them, of course, I talk about non-lethal aid. And that's one of the functions of Rebuild Ukraine. And then finally, something that Dr. Litak has already so eloquently elaborated on, there is, of course, a massive refugee crisis. And we will, again, dwell on this in some detail. So Rebuild Ukraine has the capacity of providing European Union drugs, specifically the drugs from the Baltics, German-made, and the drugs that are made in Lithuania, prescription drugs into the country. So what we're doing and what we have the capacity to do is we have a distribution center in Ternopil where we have a staff of about 10, and then we also have a distribution center in the country's capital in Kyiv, and we are capable of providing these drugs to at least 60 destinations. That's 60. So what you have on the picture is a staffer of Rebuild Ukraine sorting a specific drug that controls thyroid hormone deficiency. There are about 3 to 5% of people who suffer from this particular problem in the United States, and the numbers of those in Ukraine are much higher, as high as 20% is sometimes cited. So L-thyroxine is what she's sorting, but we're also providing prescription drugs to help with diabetes, to help with control high blood pressure, and also commonly used antibiotics. So our signature item is a tourniquet. And what you see on the picture is a Ukrainian Red Cross, which we are supplying with the tourniquets. So in the situation when the International Red Cross has actually run out of them, at least in Ukraine, we have the capacity to supply the Red Cross inside the country. So a tourniquet is really quite crucial, and a tourniquet is something that ideally each defender needs to have two of them on both arms. Principally what they do, they're high quality bandages that control the sort of the gushing wound, that control intense bleeding. So why are they important? If they're applied properly, if they're applied at the right time, and if you have enough time, essentially to the area of the mobile hospital where aid could be then given to a person, these types of devices have the capacity of actually increasing somebody's life expectancy by a factor of 7. So if you have a situation where you are likely going to die of the wound in battle, they are actually saving lives. And so we have now the capacity to provide 1,000 of them a week. We now have phenomenal feedback from the surgeons and from the medics that work in the war zones. And the report principally is that these particular types of tourniquets are really absolutely wonderful and very efficient. So unfortunately, of course, we've had to deploy them now by the hundreds. And when I say by the hundreds, I mean hundreds a day. So potentially that translates into tens of lives, conservatively, or perhaps hundreds of lives saved a day. And that was we thought very pragmatically about this because on both sides of the Atlantic there are businessmen and IT professionals who are working on this with us. And so we thought, what is it that would allow us to save as many lives as we can, given the fact that we've had fairly modest resources? And so we're really very happy to report that by Easter, we will have delivered 5,000 tourniquets into the country. We have the capacity to deliver significantly more. We could increase our capacity to a factor of at least 3 or 4. And if the war is going to continue, that's what we intend to do. So this particular soldier has, before the war, had a flourishing construction company in Kyiv. He's also about my age, maybe slightly older. Remember, as Dr. Litak mentioned, males of 60 years or younger, unless they have special circumstances, are not allowed out of the country. In this particular case, this wonderful man volunteered. And so he has military experience, so do I. He has military experience, and so he has volunteered, essentially, his services to this voluntary defense force. So everything that you see on him was provided by Rebuild Ukraine. And so again, we have the capacity to send everything from the camouflage uniform to boots to fleece jackets to backpacks to protective goggles. And we've also actually started also manufacturing neck warmers. So as Paul mentioned, it's going to be snowing in Minnesota soon. Well, guess what? In Ukraine, maybe the climate is not quite as harsh, but it's fairly humid. And so it really, if you're hiding and if you've been exposed to rain, we discovered also, by the way, that the Ukrainian army did not provide anybody with raincoats. So one of our first missions was actually to bring in raincoats. And again, the reason for that is obviously you then are not in a situation where your whole unit is sick for several weeks. And you've got very, very different types of problems. So how are we able to do this? Well, of course, in the United States, we have people with significant managerial experience and also prominent educators joining our board. We are, of course, chronically understaffed when it comes to basic things, and I'll talk about them soon. In Ukraine itself, we have a growing network of more than 100 volunteers that are coordinated by a staff of 10 plus people in distribution centers. And these are really high-functioning people, so all of them essentially are involved in this work 24/7. We are delighted to report that in the first 5 weeks of the war, we were able to raise $250,000, and $200,000 is already working, has already been sent in direct aid to Ukraine. Our Lithuanian business partners have been actually so impressed with these efforts that they themselves have provided a matching grant over 50,000 euros, again, in support of some of the activities that we're undertaking. And so we hope in the months ahead, God willing, to expand this activity. And I will talk about just one project, just one specific project that testifies to the particular expansion. So the slide that you see to the left is the maternity ward that was bombed in Mariupol in the early days of the war. And you might also recall the same town in the south of Ukraine. This was a drama theater that was used as a bombing shelter with two clearly marked graffiti saying in Russian, specifically for the Russian bombers, okay, saying children. And this is what happened to this drama theater that same day when the elderly and children and women were hiding in it. And that is, it was bombed to pieces. And as a result of this particular bombing, 300 children died. So, I travel, I speak about these matters, I raise funds, but when I hear these stories, my heart just simply turns to ashes. And so it's true that it would be very difficult to help the children themselves who are dead, but we're trying to do as much as we possibly can for those who are still alive. This is a picture that was taken by an iconographer friend of mine who is presently traveling to the east of the country, to the Donbass area, where we are also expecting very intense fighting to happen in the next few days. So this is a child's toy that was sort of half destroyed by the bombing. So what are we trying to support then when it comes to refugees? Our particular focus is going to be children. And it's going to be a focus during the war and also post-war, because we're thinking that the rebuilding of Ukraine is going to take decades. I mean, I kid you not, it is going to take decades. And so this is a highly meet Yulia Matsui, who was a colleague of my brother's and was an IT engineer that was working on one of his projects, who found herself in a situation of having to flee the country. Her husband is actually presently fighting. He presently is in the defense force. He didn't have to be, but again, he enlisted as a volunteer. While Yulia herself, with two other brave women, saw immediately when she arrived to Montenegro, she realized that around her were refugee children. Again, the kinds of children that were shown to us today already in Poland. And in addition to these children, she also discovered that there were, again, through simply informal connections, she discovered that there were 8 refugee families with women who happened to be teachers. So what does she do? She decides she's actually going to organize a school for these kids. And the reason, of course, that's important is because the kids, as they crossed the border, went into this mode, again, of not speaking to others, or actually very much wanting to share what they've experienced. And some of them come from these very, 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 heavily shelled and heavily damaged areas, which of course also means a damage on child's psyche. And so their immediate impulse was to simply look into their computers and shut out the external world. So what Yulia has organized is this wonderful school, and most of this school, as you can see, exists at this point in the open air. Now, this might look idyllic, but obviously the weather is not always conducive to being able to study in the open air. So in this case, they are ingeniously using a dancing studio. But of course, this can only be a temporary classroom. And one of the things that we will be providing in the coming months is specifically the classroom space for this school. So again, as you can see, this doesn't remind you of the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know what would. This almost, but this is essentially kids studying. And yes, the weather is fabulous today, but where would we be when, again, snow comes in 4 days and we still have to be back to the classrooms? And so these are these wonderful three courageous women that have organized essentially what amounts to a school cooperative. The beauty of this is that you give structured time to kids that actually absolutely need to channel right now their emotions, their thoughts. And as you can see, they're drawing a lot, and that's important, and that's a good thing. So for example, this boy is writing down the word Ukraine as he's, again, his young soul is processing what's happening. So you're giving structure to children, but you're also giving employment and dignity to these part-time teachers. And so we've got essentially these 8 teachers interested in continuing what they're doing, really free of charge. But at the same time, we understand that in the refugee situation, any amount helps. And so we will be, our projection is that the school will need 10,000 a month for the next 3 months. And then obviously there will be a summer break, and then we'll see. But that's an important pilot project that we will be supporting. So what we would essentially need would be part-time salaries for 8 part-time teachers and then classroom space. And if that program would need to continue past this time, we will try to also ensure that they are financially secure for the years ahead. So let me simply turn now to the question of what each of us can do. And I'm specifically, of course, addressing our students, but also everybody in this room. So one possibility would be to become a Rebuild Ukraine ambassador. And the most obvious thing that you would do as an ambassador would simply be to call or text 3 friends and tell them about the programs that might have excited you. So, for example, today you've heard about prescription drugs, and maybe that's something that's existentially important to you. I mean, I know, for example, I'm only 50, but that small dose of high blood pressure medication is important in my life. So if that's, for example, existentially important, maybe you could focus on that. Or you've looked at our program having to do with tourniquets, and again, that attracted your attention. That would be another element that you could support. Or again, I've talked already about a school for children. If that is where your sort of interests lie, perhaps that would be something, again, worth sharing with your friends. You yourself might not be able to contribute, but perhaps a friend that you know could join in the program. And so ambassadorship also doesn't mean also reaching out to friends, but it could also be organizing a fundraiser in your community. So we've done fundraisers thus far in 7 or 8 churches, and we intend to continue this work. And those have been, thanks be to God, tremendously successful. And our next one doesn't even require the presence of yours truly. This would simply be a collection taken at the Westminster Abbey in London, United Kingdom. And so we're truly honored that the heart of the Anglican Church has looked upon our humble endeavor and decided that they were going to support us. And I would say also that the outpouring of human cooperation and just incredibly active compassion has truly been extraordinary. And that is also what we run on. It's this desire of so many people to join in the effort. And then finally, as I said, we're chronically understaffed. And so especially our business majors, but also everybody with the requisite skills, we absolutely could benefit from a volunteer running our website. So we have a website, but running it is a different story, and it's fairly It's fairly simple, but we would need, things like data entry and, minimal design and things like that. So simply talk to me after this event, after the fundraiser, if you would like to join. We certainly could benefit from a marketing volunteer, and then also a finance internship, and then somebody to help us strategize on the question of the events taking place in the United States, but also streamlining some of the processes that we have at the moment in the organization, especially, for example, about 5 groups of volunteers from the United States turn to me every day. And it would be, for example, very helpful to have someone appointed trying to find a way in which we could channel their activities, we could channel their enthusiasm. So that's an element that's presently missing. And then also, we could certainly benefit somebody with an eye to design and for specifically work on the materials that we disseminate. And by the way, there is a little brochure, a 2-pager on what we're doing. And so if you're interested, we could certainly talk a bit more. And the commitments that I'm talking about are typically 3 to 5 hours a week. So finally, to state the obvious, we could certainly benefit from your support, and the support that you give today will be put to work in Ukraine tomorrow. Thank you very much.